Welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Jeff Ballou. I'm the news editor for the Americas with Al Jazeera English and the 110th president of this club. It's a privilege tonight to have a longtime friend and colleague join the club for its headliner series, this time for a book wrap in the form of Peter Baker. You'll notice I'm not reading from anything because I know Peter in a good way. Peter and I first met when we were covering then President Bill Clinton, when he was at the Washington Post, and I was at CONUS as a White House producer. Peter before then had worked in this building at the Washington Times, but when we met, he was one of Katharine Graham's sons. But what we have seen, and many of you have seen, those of you who know Peter have read his work over time, we have all watched his star rise. We have watched him not just cover the United States, but we've also covered be based in Moscow and other places, and writing so wonderfully and eloquently about affairs foreign and domestic. And he's had the privilege of covering a number of presidents. He has written 3 other books before the book that we are going to discuss tonight, Obama, The Call of History. And if you haven't picked it up, this lovely, beautiful piece of work is for sale outside of the room, and some of the proceeds will go to the National Press Club Journalism Institute, where we fund journalism education, advocacy for a free and independent press, and for diversity in the profession and scholarships. So we encourage you to support our nonprofit institute and at the same time support Peter as he goes forward in this latest venture. But what we're going to do tonight, and just a couple of housekeeping rules, if you have a cell phone, we encourage you to silence it, but we don't encourage you to put it away, because we are in the 21st century here at the Press Club, and we encourage you to tweet. So in that vein, the particular handles are at Press Club DC, and if you're trying to say something nice, hopefully nice about me, it's at NPC President, at Peter Baker NYT, and hashtag headliners. So I know it's a lot to remember, but it will go smoothly. Believe me, trust me. And some of you might even want to send me questions via Twitter. And that's why we have a presidential iPad. So I will try to keep up with any questions you send, and we will definitely get into a Q&A, and as when that time comes, raise your hand. We'll try to get a microphone to you so we can hear you, because this event is being recorded on videotape for the archives of the club and so forth. So again, that's at Press Club DC, at NPC President, at Peter Baker NYT, hashtag headliners. So with that, Peter, let's talk about your approach to this book. Why did you structure it in what, the books you've written prior to that have been relatively ordinary standard textbooks. This is not so small. It's good for morning weightlifting and great for a coffee table. And it's highly visual. And it includes the photographs of people you and I both know very well who have taken pictures of many presidents. People like Doug Mills and Stephen Crowley and other people that we have worked alongside with at the White House in a prior life of mine. Talk to me about your approach to this book.
Right. Well, first of all, can everybody hear me? Thank you very much for having me, Jeff. It's a great honor to be here. We have known each other for more years than you or I will admit.
Before gray hair.
Before gray hair. And and as I mentioned earlier in a different room, Jeff has been a leader of journalists at the White House, on Hill, now here at the National Press Club, and we are grateful to you for your service and your defense and promotion of the First Amendment and our business and the programs, the journalist students and the diversity programs that you're working on. So thank you very much, and thank you to Lisa and Betsy who helped set this up. I'm very grateful to you for everything, and thank you for hosting me today. You stole my line about Doug Mills and Steve Crowley. This book is as much Doug Mills and Steve Crowley's as it is mine. It started off as a picture book. It started off as a coffee table book that the paper wanted to put out. The paper put out a coffee table book at the inception of Barack Obama's presidency in 2009, and they decided that with the end of 8 rather eventful years, it might be worth doing a sort of bookend version on the backside. And it's filled with photographs and images, mainly from our New York Times photographers. Again, Doug Mills and Steve Crowley are the ones who spend the most time at the White House, but it's got a lot of others as well. And they're very gripping photographs, and they're images that tell, I think, part of the story, at least, of this presidency and this 8 years. And once they decided to do that, they called me up and said, well, would you like to write some text for this? And I thought, oh, that sounds pretty nice. I could do some captions, basically. And
they sucked you in like P.T. Barnum.
Yeah, exactly. And so, basically it's 70,000 words worth of captions, but it's, it's short in a lot of ways, much shorter than the other books that I've done. And it leans heavily on the works of my colleagues, my partners on the White House beat, a couple of whom are here tonight, Julie Davis and Mike Scheer, my competitors as well, people like Peter Mayer, Christy Parsons, Isaac DeVore, where's Isaac, and a lot of others. And by the way, my editor here, Dave Stout, I want to give a shout out to, who did a fabulous job. So it's a collective work. It has my name on the cover. In a way, I'm a little embarrassed by that because it's the work of so many different people. But I do think that in this one volume, you learn a little bit about the highlights and the lowlights of the last 8 years, and they were an eventful and 8 years that we're going to be studying and rethinking about for many years to come.
As you have probably observed, there are a number of "This is what the last 8 years were like" books that are coming out. Yours, Dave Garrow's, he was here. What separates your book from those that are already out and those that may be coming down the pike?
Well, pictures, among other things. I mean, this is going to be the easiest book to read because it is in fact very visual, and I think that's the strength of the book. It's not meant to be a history in the sense of Dave Garrow's very comprehensive biography of the president. It's meant to be the story in a very multimedia kind of way, really, in a multi modality way of this presidency. And I think the text itself is straight down the middle. It's not pro or con. It's not making an argument that he's a great president or a terrible president, which a lot of books do. It's not a polemic. It's meant to be a New York Times style, analytical but even-handed, narrative of these 8 years with some amazing characters. Starting with the president of the United States himself and the people around him like Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, Bob Gates, John Kerry, the people who are on the other side like Mitch McConnell, Paul Ryan, John Boehner. And if you think back, we're also absorbed what's happening today with the current White House, as we ought to be. But those 8 years, I think, will shape our history for a long time to come, and we need to go back and look at it.
But there was something, as I was reading through the book, something I picked up on was this. It wasn't just the stories as you told them at the time. There was a lot of perspective. You went back and you found, because a lot of the people in the Obama White House went out and wrote books. They did a lot of interviews, and you had that sort of wealth of material to draw from, and you put it in this book. Some of, at least a lot of it, so you could get a sort of a 360 of this president. Why did you do that?
Well, it's not a newspaper story. It is a history, and it's meant to be, offer perspective, because we do all know the story in a general sense. So hopefully this takes you inside the room a little bit. Hopefully it takes you behind the scenes a little bit, and hopefully it offers a little bit of, benefit of hindsight observation about what turned out to be important, what turned out not to be, right? We all, and this is something that President Obama talked about all the time, we all thought the BP spill was going to be the biggest story, in years, and that probably in the end is not one of the bigger stories of his presidency. On the flip side, he probably didn't think that the Syria red line was going to be such an important moment in his presidency, and yet it did. And so, time and perspective offers an opportunity to evaluate. How do you look at this president now, given who succeeded him? His story, Barack Obama's story, is not over yet, right? In some ways, it's being shaped day in, day out today by Donald Trump. Good ways and bad. You can make your arguments, but you've rarely seen, I think, a president come in as determined as this one is to sort of take a political sledgehammer brick by brick and try to tear down the predecessor's legacy. Now, he's only succeeding in some ways and not in others, and we don't know how that's going to end up, but that's important to shaping our understanding of President Obama, too. And I think the contrast, you couldn't have a bigger contrast between two presidents, between our current one and the last one, and I think that shapes how we think about the last one as well.
Does that break the fraternity of ex-presidents when you look at all the presidency as an arc, and you're starting to just comparing 45 and 44, there's no other example in history where an incumbent goes after his predecessor's legacy that way, and just for the education of those who may not have the benefit of all the history of the presidents in their brain.
Well, clearly a new president coming in, particularly one of another party, changes direction, right? Mm-hmm. And they do change things. There's sort of like this ping pong policy game on the first day of a new presidency where we sign executive orders undoing the ones that the last guy did. Mexico City abortion policy is the main, sort of not symbolic, but particularly repetitive example. Ronald Reagan put it in place. Bill Clinton rescinded it. George W. Bush put it back in place. Ping pong effect. Ping pong. Yeah. But there's a difference between changing direction and changing a handful of policies and actually trying to dismantle a whole structure of a presidency. Richard Nixon was not for the Great Society, but he didn't undo it once he came in. Dwight Eisenhower did not undo the New Deal when he came in. Ronald Reagan said he was going to close the education department and the energy department that Jimmy Carter had started, but he didn't. In the end, he moved forward. He decided to go for his policies moving forward. And what we've seen so far in 5 months, and it's only been 5 months, is a president so far who's more interested, it seems like, in undoing things than having success anyway at moving ahead on his own proactive agenda. We've got time. We may get to that point. But what are we debating now? We're debating health care, right? Whether to undo President Obama's health care program. If so, how to do it. Could it be fixed? If it needs fixing, what did he announce just a week or two ago? He announced he was undoing some of the Cuba policy. As Julie wrote in this paper, it was more show than it was substance, but that's part of what he's trying to get across is I am undoing what President Obama did. And I think that is different than previous presidents.
And speaking of which, does that, in terms of the Obama legacy, how does that reflect on the notion of a president that came into office, and I'm speaking of Barack Obama, with so much promise and so much that was sort of superimposed upon him by so many different vantage points and different parties, that at the end of the day, which we all know, his relationship with Congress basically collapsed, especially after the Tea Party, house cleaning of 2010, and that he basically governed by executive order. Yep. And how does that portend in terms of lessons learned of how to build constructive relationships between the branches of government as it relates to the Obama legacy?
No, it's a good question, and I think that one thing that for President Obama you're learning today is if you live by the pen and the phone, you can die by the pen and the phone, right? If you sign executive orders to implement policy, that may be an effective way of bypassing a hostile Congress, but it also could be undone more easily by your successor, and that there is an advantage if you can find a way to pass legislation that tends to last longer, right? Especially if you can get any kind of bipartisan buy-in. Now, what President Obama would say is that wasn't possible, that he had a recalcitrant, obstructionist Republican Congress that wasn't interested in working with him. I think President Trump today is sort of saying the same thing about the Democrats. Now, we can all argue about where we really parcel the blame on this, but it is interesting, basically, that we are now, for the last number of years, governing entirely within our own majority party or our own minority party to some extent. Donald Trump is not negotiating with Democrats so far. He might change his mind. He's trying to find votes within the 52 Republicans he has in the Senate. And that's, we've seen a lot of that in the last 6 to 8 years. That is hard for a president to build a lasting legacy on. And I think that, it's hard to see how that changes at the moment.
But pretty early on in your book and other tellings of the Obama legacy, you pull out some of the magic moments where he essentially turns to Congress and says elections have consequences, and it looks like he gives up pretty way early on trying to be how he was taught by his mentors in Springfield, over a poker game and how to cut a deal and all those other things. It looks like he just simply threw up his hands. Is that an accurate reflection of what he actually did when at the end of the day, even though he ended up being golfing buddies with John Boehner and all those other good things?
Yeah, I think there's something to that. I mean, look, Springfield, Illinois is not the same thing as Washington, D.C., and that we don't have a system like that. And we can't, unfortunately, anymore, they don't sit over poker games and cut deals. Maybe that's a good thing. But I do think he gave up pretty early. Now, what he would tell you is it's all fakery. That would be fake news to him. He would say that when the media said, "Gosh, you should work more with Republicans or try to work with them," that was nonsense, because Republicans never had any interest in working with him. And he has a point. Politically, Republicans had an interest in not working with him. Their dynamics, just like the dynamics of today, discourage working across party lines. At the same time, I do think there's something to be said for not giving up. That in fact, yes, he's right. One Super Bowl isn't going to change Mitch McConnell into a buddy of his. But it grew so calcified so early that it seemed impossible to kind of bridge the divide on many occasions where other presidents might have been able to do it. He said himself, the one regret he really had, which he expressed in one of his State of the Unions, was his inability to bridge the partisan divide. Again, I think he would put most of the blame for that on the Republicans, but I think he actually has some regret on his side too.
Which leads to sort of a broader question. I mean, there's been a lot of reporting. Is there something in this that you learned, even though you were there for a large part of it? Is there something about it that you didn't know when you went back and put this book together?
That's a good question, actually. I think I think you learn that he did do a lot of things, right? And that there was a lot that was accomplished, and some of them are debated as to their merits and demerits. But think of all the different things that came up over 8 years. I mean, we were on the edge of an economic abyss, right? And the economy today is still obviously not where a lot of people would want it to be, but it's so much different than what he inherited. He did save the auto industry. Osama bin Laden was hunted down and killed. There were regulations on Wall Street. There was action on climate change through the EPA, if not through Congress. There was action on immigration, again, through executive action, not through Congress. A lot of these things are still debated, and some of them are being undone. But I think we forget just how much happened in these 8 years. And that's not even talking about foreign policy, where we could talk about Russia and Syria and Egypt and Libya.
Well, speaking of which, because you spent time in Russia, how would you compare, as sort of bring it to the present state? How would you compare what the policy vis-a-vis Moscow is now versus what, in hindsight, what President Obama, you think through your reporting, the team's reporting, was trying to sort of unpack and reveal, to the world, in terms of, was he going for an end game that we just couldn't divine, which is what would explain some of the things he may have not done, for example, in recent days, being trashed for not pulling the trigger of this so-called bomb, internet bomb that could have, cybersecurity bomb that could have gone after the Russians. Was he going for a long-term strategy in Syria or something like that, where he decided that was just not the thing? What did you discover in your reporting in that regard, in terms of comparing Barack Obama and Donald Trump?
It's interesting, actually, because actually Barack Obama came in. He was the third president in a row to come in determined to have a reset with Russia. Obama's the one who used the phrase reset. And, for a couple years, it actually kind of worked. There were some things that were accomplished between the two countries. A transit route for troops to Afghanistan, a nuclear arms treaty, cooperation on sanctions on Iran. And then Vladimir Putin came back to power. And the mistake that Barack Obama made was he had hoped that he could build up Dmitry Medvedev as an actual alternative power figure in Russia. It wasn't going to happen. He may not have had another choice. That may have been the best play given the options. What Donald Trump is been talking about in some ways is not that different in the sense that he says we ought to be able to work with Russia. That's what Barack Obama agreed on too. What happened over his 8 years, though, was we saw that was increasingly difficult when Vladimir Putin seized Crimea and then interfered in eastern Ukraine, when he sent troops to Syria, when he meddled in the election last year. And so, any hopes that Obama had at the beginning of a rapprochement, of a partnership, had long since dissipated by last year. Now, why did he not do something more active in the fall when he knew that Russia was trying to influence the election? I think that's a question that I would love to actually ask him that question, because we haven't actually had a chance.
We're trying to bring him back to the club.
We would like to do that. What his people, I think, would say is that, A, he's a naturally cautious person, right? He's not given to sort of bombastic rhetoric or precipitous actions. It's not his nature. His foreign policy, remember, was boiled down into 4 words: don't do stupid stuff.
Cleaning that up.
Yeah, and so I think he was wanting to be cautious on a geopolitical level. I think he wanted to be cautious on a political level because, it looked like Hillary Clinton was going to win. And if he comes out and says, hey, the Russians are messing around with things, it would be very obvious that Donald Trump would say, aha, this is a rigged election. Look, he's trying to put his foot on the scale. And they were I think Lisa Monaco told my wife in one of her podcasts for Global Politico, shameless plug, was that they were worried about election day. They were worried about voter rolls. They were worried about interference in the actual process of casting and counting votes, and they were focused on that more than they were on making a public stink about it. They did make a public announcement on October 7th. It just happened to be the same day the Access Hollywood tape came out. But so it's not right to say he did nothing. He did, in fact, obviously impose sanctions after the election. But there are people within his own team who wanted him to do more and wish he had.
Was there something in
and it's worth noting that
yes.
It is worth noting that when President Trump today says, oh, how terrible it was, he didn't do anything, he's complaining about something he has denied ever happened, and something for which he has actually done nothing in the 4 or 5 months that he's been president. So if there was something to be done about Russian meddling, he's had 4 or 5 months himself to do something and chosen not to.
Do you think he probably saw some intelligence that probably shook him and said, hey, as much as I may be bombastic out here, the CIA and, walks into the Oval Office and say, Mr. President, you may want to do this, but you may not want to.
You mean Trump?
Trump.
He did see intelligence, and then he dismissed it. I mean, he was given intelligence by 17 intelligence agencies that said not only was Russia meddling in the election, they did it with the express purpose of helping Donald Trump be elected. Now, I think we could debate whether it actually had too much effect or not. I'm a skeptic that it actually changed any outcome. But it does seem to be a consensus of the intelligence community that they tried. And so far, President Trump has expressed no particular concern about that or even a strong belief that it actually happened. James Comey testified the other day in the Senate that in all of their conversations they had never once did the president say, hey, what about this Russian hacking thing? Is there something we should be doing about it now? Because as Comey said, it hasn't stopped. They're still trying to penetrate our systems.
Books like this have the benefit of hindsight. When you look into the rearview mirror that this is, what key things in the Obama legacy, decisions that he probably could have gone a different way, and it's hard to second guess when you're in the hot seat of the Oval Office. What is it that he could have done differently in some very pivotal parts of his presidency that might have had a better outcome in the long run?
Well, it's a good question. The counterfactuals are really hard, and I in general, we should probably avoid them. But I think that if you look back at his foreign policy, for instance, he was trying to be the remedy, to use David Axelrod's word, to Bush, right? If Bush was too quick on the trigger, if he was too much of a cowboy, too unilateralist, then President Obama was determined to be the opposite. And sometimes that might have worked, and sometimes it might not. I think Libya was really a key moment for him. We don't pay much attention to Libya. We talk about Benghazi, but the real interesting thing about Libya is, what did we learn from the intervention there? He took he had NATO as the lead force, and the United States was meant to support it. And then he very much did not want to get involved or get trapped in what he saw as the same mess that George Bush had been trapped in Iraq by nation building afterwards. But unfortunately, what happened then was left behind was kind of a really messy outcome in Libya that would then lead later to Benghazi. And I think it shaped his thinking, and people in this room would probably know better than I do, particularly where are we over here? Someplace over in the back over there. But I think it shaped his thinking about Syria. It shaped his thinking about other places in the Middle East. Don't get the United States entangled again in these Middle East wars. And it's very understandable because, we've had such a traumatic experience in these last 16, 17 years. But in the process, I don't think he found a formula that satisfied him, and certainly he didn't find a formula that ultimately had the influence he would have liked to have had, I think, in places like Syria.
I want to sort of switch it up a little bit. Part of this book is heavy on substance, but it is brilliant on visual, as I mentioned in the opening comments. Walk us through some of the photos as they are tied to key moments in the Obama presidency, and having been there, sort of unpack what was happening at that moment, and do we know something now that's different than what was happening in the moment? Yeah. So let's start with what you have here and describe it to the folks here.
This is not the inauguration, okay? I know, but it's a big crowd. Okay, whatever you look at it. This is October of 2008. It was a rally in St. Louis. But it was obviously emblematic of the very powerful crowds that this is going so fast.
We think the space bar will slow it down, or
here. Let's see.
Hold on.
All right. Let's see if I can. Let me try.
Peter was trying to find a keynote expert in the audience, but it didn't quite work out. But that's okay. We're gonna work through this.
All right, Mike, our IT guy is now in charge. We're in good shape. This is, by the way, Guantanamo. Which is an important image because it talks about his frustration in trying to achieve one of his top, or at least one of his most prominent campaign promises, which is to close it, which he wasn't able to do. All right, this is back at the beginning. That's not particularly. That's Tim Geithner, obviously. So we put that in the book, obviously, because Geithner was so critical to the response to the economic crisis, and we forget today. I think it's so easy to forget how awful it looked in 2008 when he came in. I mean, they really did not know where things were going to go, and I think Bush gets some credit for having pushed through the bailout before leaving office, which gave Obama some tools, but it was still an incredibly dicey moment that they felt could go deeply wrong. They made choices on the stimulus that Mike Grunwald here has written a whole great book about. If you want to read it, you should read his book for sure. He'll tell you more about it than I know. But they made choices there about how deep to go on the stimulus, on the kinds of things to do with the stimulus in terms of tax cuts and spending, and how effective it was. But
you also unpack a situation. You paint a picture of what was happening in sort of the temporary situation room in the transition, of just when they dropped sort of the information bomb in the room of just how bad the situation is and how jaw-dropping. They thought they knew it was bad, but it was really, really bad.
Yeah. Well, I think every White House has sort of its creation myth, and they sort of point to particular moments that shaped events from then on, right? One of the creation myth moments for the Obama presidency is December of 2008 in the Chicago Transition Office, when they come to him and they say to the president, it's so much worse than you thought. We're heading so much further south, and the dangers are extraordinary, like Great Depression level extraordinary. And, that's a very, very daunting moment for a president who had very little experience, let's face it, at the national level, really about 2 years in the Senate before he began running for president. And suddenly he was told, you're responsible for saving the country. So the choices weren't great, but he made the choices he had. And I think that, Deanna Farrell over here could talk more about the economic team and the various debates that happened in there. But it was a very serious, substantive debate in which they came up with the best approach they could given the politics they faced.
But it also speaks to the cooperation between the outgoing and the incoming White House.
Yeah, no, that's true. I think everybody would say, I think, that the Bush to Obama transition was probably a model for most other transitions, that Bush took very seriously his obligation to help his successor be as successful as possible. Certainly Josh Bolten, the White House Chief of Staff, outgoing, made clear to the staff that. And I think the Obama people were more than happy to work with the Bush people because they knew they were getting into deep and they wanted the benefit of their experience. Again, something we did not see at the end of the Obama presidency, because the Trump people didn't seem to be at all interested in talking to their predecessors. Rex Tillerson never talked to John Kerry, never went to see him. You did not see comparable, joint conversations. And I think that, any new administration you would think would have some benefit by talking to the old ones, even if you chose to do different things.
Okay, we'll move on to the next one.
So Sonia Sotomayor, one of the less heralded achievements that the president could always point to is that he put 2 women on the Supreme Court. No other president had done that, obviously, and the first Hispanic. Now, mitigating against that is that they were liberals replacing liberals, so he did not have the opportunity to change the balance, and he had
plus one or
right. It was basically vote for vote, and the chance that he did have at the end, he was blocked by the Senate Republicans when Scalia passed away, and Merrick Garland was blocked by the Senate. So, but he has this to point to for the next 30, 40, 50 years. Part of his legacy will be on the Supreme Court.
Well, let's talk about just a little bit more about Supreme Court since we just finished the last term. Talk to us about how he played the Garland nomination. As you reflect back, is there something that he got fundamentally wrong with this? Did he underestimate how much Mitch McConnell was just going to draw this line and stand and say, "Screw you"?
Yeah,
Mr. President?
it was an unprecedented kind of situation where a president with more than enough time left in his presidency to confirm a Supreme Court justice was blocked, sight unseen. It didn't matter who he nominated. It was not about the particular choice of nominee. And I think that's one of these things where parties have escalated. Both parties over the years have escalated their warfare on Supreme Court, and this will now be a precedent for the next one. So if you're a Republican in the last year of your administration and there's an opening and the Democrats have the ability to stop it, you ought to basically expect that you're not going to get a Supreme Court nomination. Democrats are very upset still to this day, and have understandably so, that they feel this seat was stolen from them. And you see the difference. Neil Gorsuch, very well-respected justice, very different than Merrick Garland would have been on many of these votes.
And on a broader sense, was that the culmination of the collapse of executive and legislative branch relations? In hindsight,
yeah, I mean, in a way, obviously, you can't pen and phone your way onto a Supreme Court confirmation, right? That's the limit of your executive power. In theory, I suppose you could have used a recess appointment, but that wouldn't have lasted for very long.
And who took this photo? I'm sorry not to give the credit to the last photo.
I have my notes someplace. Probably Doug Mills. Most of these are Doug Mills, who's fabulous. I don't see him here today, unfortunately, but he's just fabulous.
We can go on to the next one.
I like this one. This is Pete Souza, actually, the White House photographer took this. This is back when Haiti's earthquake brought these 3 presidents together. President Obama asked President Bush and President Clinton to work together on this. And I like this photo because it tells us something about the President's Club you mentioned. In the end, they have more alike than they don't in some ways. I know they're different. They have different ideologies and different personalities. But the truth is that the dynamics and the imperatives and the priorities and the options available to most presidents are within sort of the 40-yard lines, and I think these 3 presidents respect each other, and they sense how each other's challenges are. President Bush made a point of not criticizing President Obama. I think he didn't agree with President Obama on some things, but I think by and large respected him. President Clinton and President Obama actually had kind of a tough relationship at first too, because of course one was running against the other's wife. But they came around, I think, to a place of a much better place. Now, the question I have is, and 4 or 8 years, will President Trump join that club? I'm not so sure about that. I don't think these presidents think the same way of President Trump, and I don't think he thinks the same of them.
So you don't think the arc of 4 or 8 years, however long President Trump has, is going to hone him in such a way that's going to, sort of humble him, if it's such a thing as possible, and sort of smooth his way into the president's club and say he's learned, just like midterms humbled all three of those presidents in some way, shape,
That's
or
right.
form. That, I guess, the thumping, to put a Bush term on it, that if it happens, and it may not happen, he may keep his Congress after 2018. So if he goes through midterms and keeps a Republican Congress, at what point do you think he may or may not learn the lesson where he's sort of blessed by his predecessors to come into the community of nations of ex-presidents?
Look, I think presidents get better with time. Okay, I do think that almost every president you could look at becomes a better president after more and more experience, because there's no way to prepare for this job. There's just no way to prepare for it other than doing it. Second terms tend to be better than their first terms, at least in terms of the process of making decisions and the comfort and confidence with which they make them and the way they tend to lead the country. Having said that, we have collectively, as a political media conflab, have been expecting Donald Trump to change his stripes for quite a while now, and I don't think that he's shown that that's something we're likely to see. I think he is who he is. I don't think he wants to be part of that club. He's run on the idea of not being part of that club. In fact, his supporters don't want him to be there. He's the swamp drainer, in theory, and so I think he stands apart.
But doesn't that get us to the sense of us getting it wrong? Because a lot of people now, in hindsight, I was just in L.A. with Andrea Mitchell at the L.A. Press Club Awards this past weekend, and one thing she said during her remarks in getting their Lifetime Achievement Award is that we really missed the boat in this election, this past election, and that we needed to get our act together as a press corps. But she was hopeful in her remarks. What is it that we did not see in this sort of presidential vein that to get a better sense of perspective on the presidency?
Look, I think we all understood intellectually, we the media understood intellectually, that there was an angry country out there, and therefore an audience for Donald Trump's message that was resonating with at least certain parts of the country. What we failed to really grasp is how deep that was, and what we failed to really grasp is how close then the election would be, how it would come down to these 3 states in particular that would make the difference. We are based on the East Coast, most of us, but we are, locked in a bubble of in that part of the country. And I'm not a big fan of dial meters and projections of percentages on things like politics. I don't think it's an exact science. I think the idea that we can say with any kind of precision that something is going to happen is just nonsensical, and we shouldn't do it. We shouldn't have done it, and I don't think we'll do that again.
Okay, we'll move on to the next slide. This was one of the more popular.
This is definitely one of the
This
most
broke the
favorite
internet
things.
a few times.
It did, yeah. And I actually had very little to do with selecting the photographs for this book, but this is one they did not have in there on the first go around, and I said we should put in for sure, because it is one of the most memorable images of this presidency. It's an extraordinary image. I love this image because whatever else you want to say about President Obama, all the policies we can debate where he did good things or bad things, this reminds us that he was unlike any of the other 43 presidents who came before him, right? This is a little boy in May of 2009, was visiting the Oval Office and asked if he could, I think he's 5 years old, asked if he could, if the president's hair was like his hair. And the president leans down and says, "Why don't you feel it to find out?" And of course he feels it. And Pete Souza captures this moment. And it's extraordinary, right? Because this little boy and my son, who's 12, and a lot of our kids grew up only knowing an African American as president of the United States. That's not an unthinkable thing to them. That's the default. That was not only that's the only thing that they knew. And I think that we can't measure in a numerical way or whatever the impact that has on a country that has struggled with race for so many decades and centuries. But I still think that while he does not want to be remembered only as an African-American president. We cannot diminish the power of having a person in that White House who lived the life he lived, and then performed the job he had, and that we judge him based on the merits or the drawbacks of his performance. I just think that's a great photograph.
But also, on one hand, though he recognized in that sense his symbolism, race was a very mixed bag policy and legacy-wise with President Obama. Talk about that.
No, that's true, actually. And you hear some of his strongest critics for a time anyway were in the, among African-American scholars or activists who wanted him to do more, who wanted to be more proactive to help a community that they felt had always gotten the raw end of the deal. And he wasn't. That's not what he wanted to do. He did not want to be pigeonholed. He wanted to be president of all the people. And I think he felt, particularly in his first term, very nervous that if he seemed to be too attentive to issues that were seen as African-American issues, that he would diminish his broader appeal. Interestingly, by the second term, both because of events and circumstances and his own political liberation, he began talking about it more. He began, being more vocal, more willing to speak out. We had these awful police shootings and disturbances in cities and so forth. And because of that, he had to speak out more. But it didn't always translate into policies that people would have necessarily wanted. But his argument was, look, a better healthcare system lifts all boats, but it will lift the disadvantaged the most, and therefore it doesn't have to be race specific to help change race relations in this country. But I think that it was an issue he never fully, he never 100% figured out how he wanted to handle it because he felt constrained by politics.
I'll hold it there, but I have some other questions on that. Next one.
That's Paul Ryan.
Yes.
Of course. And I asked him once, I asked President Obama in 2010, I said, well, he was about to get his shellacking. He used the word shellacking, and Bush, as you said, used thumping. So in September 2010, he was about to have a shellacking. He knew it. I think they lost 68 seats in the House, which is like the most in decades. And I asked him, well, so what Republicans then can you possibly work with in this next Congress? And the only one he named who was still going to be in the next Congress is Paul Ryan, the only one. He respected his intelligence, he said. He respected him as a serious legislator. He didn't agree with him on a lot of the policies, but he thought that Paul Ryan was a serious actor who could...
So policy wonk bromance?
Yeah, a little bit. It didn't work out, though, did it?
No, it didn't.
It really didn't. And I think, again, that talks about the politics of the moment where parties feel very, it's a disincentive. It used to be, when I started covering politics, it was an incentive if you could say that a bill was bipartisan. You were rewarded in the political system for something that was seen as bipartisan, even if it wasn't really bipartisan, right? You wanted to be seen as bipartisan. Today it's the opposite. You're penalized if you're seen as bipartisan. And it's just the incentive structure has completely changed in politics.
And how does that, in looking back on the Obama legacy, what's the lesson on the path to getting back on the bipartisan track? Because with the ACA now being ripped apart, or the attempts to rip it apart, and a whole raft of other things that are happening, where not just between Democrats and Republicans, but civil wars within parties. Yeah. But the Democrats are fighting amongst themselves, the Bernie wing of the party over here and the Pelosi wing of the party over there, and then you have, of course, on the Republican side, Paul Ryan trying to hold things together, and then of course, Congressman Meadows, and then of course on the House side and on the Senate, McConnell versus pretty much everybody. And I mean, you get Rand Paul and everybody else saying, how does that work?
Healthcare is a great example, right? It's not hard to come up with 51 senators, Democrats and Republicans, who would come together for a bill that would not repeal Obamacare, but change it in ways that some people would want it to be changed, right? That would fix it on this or fix it on that, and I'm not a policy wonk on this. But the incentive structure is just, it makes it so hard, because Republicans would be penalized for keeping Obamacare, even the name is going to be a problem. Democrats, quite honestly, you just mentioned the Bernie wing. I mean, there's a real base problem for the Democrats too, in which basically cooperating with this president in particular is going to get some Democrats in real trouble, even if they might prefer the outcome. So I don't. And so far, President Trump has shown no interest in working with the other side. And I'm not sure that there's an incentive structure for the Democrats to work with him either. Healthcare will be the ultimate test of that because, this is a moment. If you're going to do it, now is the moment. But we don't see much evidence of that.
So comedy is dead on between the executive and legislative branch?
It's not.
Is it on life support?
It's not doing well. I mean, you see, it's like the terrible tragedy the other day when the gunman shoots the Republicans who were practicing for baseball. And there's this moment of like, gosh, we're all human, we're all in this together, and it lasts for an hour or 2 hours a day, and they can't bring themselves to get past this right now. Does that mean it's going to be that way forever? No, I don't think so. I mean, our history is filled with moments where we were equally divided. We were certainly not. There were a lot of divisions, obviously, leading up to the Civil War. Obviously, a lot of divisions during the McCarthy era, during civil rights, during Vietnam, during Watergate. These were divisive times. This is not a unique time in that way. What's unique about it is that social media has, I think, and the other technological changes and gerrymandering and all these other factors have made the natural dynamics much more so, right? They've taken our own natural divisiveness and exacerbated it and made it harder for anybody who wants to get past it.
I'll get to the next one. Oh, yes.
Yeah, well, Geronimo, EKIA. That's obviously probably the most famous image of this presidency, right? The day bin Laden is killed. And you saw a picture that President Trump's White House released after he had a Syria strike, in which they had it looked like almost they were trying to mimic it, right? Down in Florida, in Mar-a-Lago, they had a bunch of people around a table. But I think you could say this is an iconic image at this point. This is of course Muammar Gaddafi, who was killed or captured and killed after he was toppled out of government, and in some ways, a sort of a cautionary tale for the Obama White House after he was captured and killed. I think what was it? Hillary Clinton was quoted saying, I forgot, something celebratory. And in fact, that wasn't the end of the story. It never is. Right?
Well, in both Afghanistan and Libya, the fact a lot of the region is still a mess.
Yeah.
So for all of the brief celebration or of the capture and killing of Osama bin Laden, and the same with Muammar Gaddafi, foreign policy, at least definitely in that part of the world, is in tatters. Is that something, as you looked at the book, that say he didn't get that right, did he?
Well, he didn't succeed where he would have wanted to succeed. And I'll leave it to others to say whether it was how much is his fault or somebody else's fault, or you'll still hear Obama people say it's Iraq is the original sin, but he did not accomplish what he would have wanted to accomplish. I think he got excited by, as many of us did, by the Arab Spring in 2011, and a lot of us bought into the idea that this was going to be Eastern Europe of 1989 all over again, and it didn't turn out to be that way, and it became messy. And when it became messy, he disengaged. He didn't want to be involved
because he didn't have the relationship with Putin. We all know the relationship he didn't have with Netanyahu, and then.
Well, in the public, by the way, he reflected an American public that wasn't all that interested either. You could argue, by the way, as much as Trump is an opposite of Obama, the one thing they actually kind of share, the one thing that actually kind of a validation Obama might argue in Trump's election is the sentiment that, in theory, we don't want to be involved in other people's wars. That's what Trump ran on. Now he's kind of been somewhat all over the map, but that is in theory what he talked about last year, and that's not that different than what President Obama talked about. Now, President Obama, I think, would say we still need to exert leadership, we still need to be an active player, we still need to, assert American values, but both of them reflected a weariness on the part of the public that, after 16, 17 years of war.
One last thing, and we'll move on to the next one. The Republicans often charged him with leading from behind.
Yeah.
True? not true as borne out by your reporting?
Well, I mean, they use it as a slur, of course, and but there's no question that he had, he wanted to find ways of engaging regional actors to take the lead on their own problems. That's what that originally referred to. So in other words, Libya should be Europe's problem because Europe is going to pay the price if Libya melts down. So he wanted Europe to take the lead. The problem is, as Henry Kissinger once famously said, when I want to talk to Europe, who do I call, right? Europe has never, or very rarely, been able to take the lead successfully in a lot of these circumstances, and America ends up picking up the mess. You can look back at the Balkans during the 1990s as another example of that. So leading from behind meant that he wanted others to rise to the occasion, and they didn't. And the question then is, how much is it America's responsibility then to step forward? He was more cautious than even some of his own advisors would have wanted him to be, right? Some of them argued, like Joe Biden, that they should send arms to Ukraine, that they should arm the Syrian rebels. He didn't want to do that. So I think, his was I think I would use cautious to use, is probably the best word.
To be more blunt, did he blow Syria?
Well, it's gonna be one of the things that haunts him in the history books. If President Clinton feels, regrets Rwanda today, I'm sure President Obama feels some sense that, of frustration that he didn't get a solution to Syria. Hundreds of thousands of people are dead. Millions were displaced. Again, how much you should lay this on his door as opposed to others, I'll leave to others. But clearly, as a leader of the last superpower, he would have liked to have been able to influence that situation in a way that he didn't.
But there's a string of failed relationships. Congress, Putin, Netanyahu. What does this say about President Obama's character as a negotiator, as a builder, good, bad, or otherwise? I mean, yes, he, obviously he's, wonder twins with Angela Merkel, but, but not so much the others I just mentioned.
A lot of them like him more now. I have to say, he's doing sort of what,
his Miss Me Now tour.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Dinner with Justin Trudeau.
Yeah, Bush did that too. Everybody does that, so kind of, sort of.
Right. Yeah. Gosh. He was. Look, he's not a hail fellow, well-met guy, right? It's not his nature to rely on personal chemistry as the basis for policy. Presidents have come in and criticized previous presidents for doing too much of that. He did the opposite, you could argue. How much that would make a difference is a really good question. He had good relationships, but not great relationships with a lot of leaders around the world. And I think they respected him. You saw on the Pew poll the other day that 64% of people around the world in 37 countries that they surveyed, 64% had faith that President Obama, when he was in office, would do the right thing. Today, the number's 22% for President Trump. So I think you're right. The Miss Me Now thing is probably right. They may have had their frustrations with President Obama, but there's certainly, in some parts of the world, a real nostalgia.
Okay, what's next?
Well,
oh, yes.
This is my brother Joe, as he called him, brother from another mother. They were not friends. They were not even close when they started. They were really, really scratchy at the beginning. We don't talk about that much, but they're very different personalities, right? Joe Biden is just what we talked about President Obama not being. He loves people. He loves politics. He's an extrovert, whereas President Obama is an introvert. Joe Biden gets energy off of crowds. He gets energy off of other people. And President Obama found him, kind of annoying at first. And, and he would make fun of Vice President Biden in public settings to the point where Biden eventually told him at lunch, please stop that. You're undercutting me. This whole Uncle Joe stuff doesn't, make me a better vice president. And Obama respected that and kind of backed off. But what's interesting is how much their relationship really changed over time. It really did grow closer.
They became very close.
They did. I think they became genuinely closer. I think that,
how did that translate policy-wise?
Well, Vice President Biden didn't win all the fights, that's for sure. Vice President Biden would have been on the let's not intervene side of most of the foreign policy fights. But, there were times where, the White House would tell you he messed up by endorsing same-sex marriage before the president got around to it. That didn't endear them. But I think that Obama came to respect Biden for who he was, right? Like he got it. And by the end, there's that Medal of Freedom ceremony at the very end where Obama surprises Biden with the Medal of Freedom. I don't know
And tears
Oh
streaming
my
down
God,
Biden's
yeah,
eyes. He was
yeah.
done.
I think they were both genuinely. I think they're both surprised at how close they became. They may not be fishing buddies for the rest of their lives, but I think they became.
I
close.
think I think it's time to start going out here because we could obviously talk forever. We know each other forever. So let's. Who's got some hands up here? Hold on.
Oh, I'm sorry.
What's your name?
Gwen Gibson. I'm a former reporter. Well, still. But anyway, how would you compare Obama to JFK and Michelle to Jackie?
Okay. Do you heard the question? Is
Well,
comparing?
repeat that. Comparing President Obama and Michelle to John F. Kennedy and Jackie.
What's really interesting about this president is
Keep your hands up so I know where to go next. If
we
you have
compared
questions.
him to like almost every president at some point or another, right? When he was elected, we said it was Camelot reborn. It was African American Camelot. They're young, they're dynamic, they have a seemingly very healthy family relationship, and there was something kind of Obama cool, right? But at various other moments, he was also compared to Lincoln, right? He actually encouraged that himself. He announced his election bid from the steps of the old State House in Springfield, just like Lincoln did. He was compared to FDR when we figured we needed somebody to pull us out of a depression. He was compared to George Washington on the cover of the New Yorker, famously with a powdered wig. Then things started going wrong. He was compared to LBJ for getting us too deep into Afghanistan. He was compared to Jimmy Carter for being kind of feckless. He was compared to George W. Bush for loving drones too much and not changing counterterrorism policy enough. And I remember interviewing one guy from the White House once. He said, the only president we haven't been compared to is Franklin Pierce. Which is good because he was a drunk, so that's good. But, we'll never know because Kennedy's allure is partly, is the incompletion and the tragedy of his tenure. And Obama finishes 8 years, so we had time to grow disappointed in him, right? We had time to see what Obama could and couldn't do. And so many people wanted Obama to be this or that. And we all kind of imposed on him to some extent, which he encouraged, our own view of who he was. He once said in 2008, I'm like a Rorschach test. People saw in him what they wanted to see because we didn't really know him very well. And inevitably, therefore, he was going to disappoint some people because he couldn't be all the things that people saw in him. But I think obviously his numbers are up today. The contrast helps him with the current president.
Hands up. Next question over here. Gentleman in the pink.
Did we run some more of the photos too?
Oh, we will. I just wanted to make sure I am listening. I heard the grumbling and folks wanted to ask some questions, so I want to get that.
Hi. How much do you think he personally blames his race as the main reason for the congressional obstruction to him?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say that some of the people around him definitely do. And I think that they reflect, to some extent, his view. But he will never say it, I don't think. At least he would never say it while he was in office. Partly, I also don't think he wants that to be the narrative. I don't think he wants to be, somebody who's seen as complaining about that. But he clearly feels it. I mean, he's a human being, and he's talked at times over. This is a great one. I love this. This is the second debate at Hofstra University in 2012. We just saw with Romney, and he had gotten shellacked in his first debate. In the second one, he was much more aggressive. And the headline on the New York Times analysis the next day, which I love, was just 3 words. It was just punch, 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 which I thought summed up that debate. But I think, yes. Does he think that? My guess is yes. I'm looking forward to his memoir to see how openly he addresses that.
Next, young lady here in the red. Yeah, we definitely want to see these pictures, but we also want to walk through them. There's not in a loop, so we have to sort of start it over.
Yeah. Or you can buy the book. They're all in there. Every single one.
Which we encourage you to do.
After covering past 2 presidencies, or now actually 3, right? After covering several presidencies, how do you see the change in your reporting of each one, since each president covers different topics, focus on different policies and strategies in approaching their presidency?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that's changed is just the nature of our business. You know, when I started covering President Clinton in 1996, I carried a beeper around because they would tell us when they had a statement. The beeper would say there's a statement in the bin. That meant you had to actually go to the White House to go look at the piece of paper sitting in the bin, right? Right, and none of this email stuff. But the thing was, it didn't matter if I went there at 1 o'clock in the afternoon or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, because I'm not going to file until 6 o'clock in the afternoon. Our work is so different today, and it changes how we cover the White House and how the White House interacts with us. Everything is instantaneous. Everything has to be up right away. I got in trouble with my editors the other day because some story happened and they wanted 2 sentences that they could throw on the web right away, and I made the mistake of writing 2 paragraphs. And I took too long to write 2 paragraphs. So that's so different than when I started. You know, you had time, even if it was just a few hours, to try to learn about a subject. Covering the White House means you have to write about Medicare, you have to write about gay rights, you have to write about the national debt, you have to write about foreign policy, and sometimes you have to do it all in the same day. And I'm very lucky that I have 5 fabulous partners right now who are so much smarter than I am, who know more about these issues. And between us, we usually can put together our heads, but it's just a dynamic that's accelerated 1,000-fold. And then, by the way, that means that the White House is like constantly on your case as well, and very fixated on small things like Twitter. The last thing I'll say about that is the Obama White House got mad at you, not when you wrote a front page story saying their Syria policy was feckless. They got mad at you when you wrote something stupid on Twitter. They got really obsessed about small things sometimes.
Peter, it's Lisa Matthews, Headliners co-chair. Thank you so much for agreeing to come to the press club. 2 questions for you. First one, if you could reflect back on when Obama talked about Trayvon Martin and what it meant for the country at that time. And then secondly, if you could also reflect on his relationship with the First Lady, Michelle Obama, and the kind of romance that seemed to be growing out of the White House in their interactions publicly.
Yeah. You could cycle through it again. Yeah, they start again, I'm afraid. This time. Yeah, I think Mike Shear was going to write a whole story about the relationship between Barack and Michelle Obama, but no. Look, you know, there was something, I think, to the public anyway, that was pretty refreshing about, you know, a president and first lady who seemed to, you know, enjoy each other's company and be partners and have a healthy, you know, family relationship. The Bushes too, by the way. I think the Clintons kind of soured us for a while on presidential families. Sorry, but but I think you know, she didn't want to be in politics. Like, she was much more resistant to that than most first ladies have been, and she felt, I think, trapped in a world that wasn't of her own making. You know, and she went along with it, and she was very supportive of her husband, and you have to, you know, she did what she could, and she, you know, took on some issues that she wanted to work on, but she did not want to be first lady, and she told her staff when they came in, I'm going to give you 2 days a week, maybe 3 days a week, and that's it. I'm going to be with my daughters, and she wasn't going to take on really controversial issues. She felt burned by the campaign. She hated that New Yorker cover that, you know, with the fist bump and the whole baby mama thing. And she talked about that. She talked about that in Oberlin, by the way, Oberlin College commencement in 2015, maybe, I guess it was. She talked about like how hard it was for her, how burned she felt about it, how over time she had to finally adjust to it. So they're very human in that way as a couple. And now they seem to be enjoying, you know, every vacation you can imagine over the world. So they're in Bali right now, and the Politico has this great photo spread.
Thing, talk about the much talked about facial expressions of Michelle Obama on Inauguration Day.
Yeah.
I mean, my God, it was all over the internet. Like, she did not want to be on that podium.
She did. I think that's fair to say. She's not talked to me about it, so I can't say for sure. But I think that's a fair reading of it. And you know, George W. Bush thought it was a kind of funny inauguration. Remember, he was quoted, right? That's some strange stuff he said.
And he claims he doesn't remember saying that, but you know.
It sounds like him. You mentioned Trayvon Martin. Yeah, that's such a personal moment, right? I think he went out there without a script, and he just said what he wanted to say. And I think he had felt like after 4 years or whatever it was at that point of holding back, he wanted to talk about this, and he wanted to relate to it in a human way. And I think that was cathartic for him in a lot of ways, cathartic for a lot of Americans in a lot of ways. But even then, even though he's saying, look, this could have been me, this could have been my son, this is part of our American experience we need to think about, he got a lot of blowback for it, right, from critics. And it just shows you what a volatile...
That was a moment he felt he couldn't win.
Of course not, right. Look, what happened early on? Skip Gates, the Harvard professor, gets arrested in his own home. President Obama is asked about it at the end of a press conference in which he talked about health care and other issues. And his sort of flip, kind of offhand remark that the police had acted stupid became the driving story. And he learned from that. He learned, if I talk about race, that's the story for the day. So I'm not going to talk about race because it will get in the way of my agenda. So for 4 years, he didn't talk about it for the most part. And he felt burned. By the second term, he was willing to talk about it more, and he was willing to talk about his own experiences and his own feelings as an African-American man who had grown up in this country. Mind you, he had a very different experience than his wife. His family is different. His father was African, right, not African-American. His mother was white. He did not grow up in the civil rights era. Eric Holder, whose sister-in-law was the first to integrate University of Alabama, had a very visceral and very personal connection to the civil rights era and the progression of race in America. President Obama grew up in Hawaii, right, and Indonesia, places that didn't have the same kind of experience. So, but then he went to Chicago, he went to New York, and he had he wrote so meaningfully and so movingly about race in his book, the first book, Dreams for My Father, that people were disappointed that he couldn't then take that and help us explain, help us bridge this issue. I think he wanted so much to bridge it. And he tried very hard. When he gave speeches, he said, on the one hand, you have to understand where African-American young men are coming from. You have to understand how the community views this. On the other hand, you have to understand how the police view it. He was trying very hard, I think, to be even-handed, but he still got excoriated for it. And it just shows what a tough issue that is in America.
Wes.
I know you came back from Jerusalem to cover Trump. How would you compare Netanyahu and Trump? Are they alike? Are they different? And you can toss in Obama, too, if you...
Well, that's a good question. A lot of Israelis who don't like Netanyahu compare him to Trump. I think it misses stuff. I think that Netanyahu is a career politician and public servant. He's very schooled on issues. He understands complexities. He shares some of the same views, perhaps, of that President Trump does, but they're very different people in that sense. And I think, frankly, Prime Minister Netanyahu is probably a little disappointed, frankly, that President Trump isn't more of what he thought he was going to be. He really didn't like President Obama, that is Netanyahu. They really did not get along. He thought Obama was naive about the region, that he was too even-handed in the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, that he was sacrificing a friend. And they personally didn't ever connect. And he felt blindsided by President Obama in the early days when President Obama insisted on a settlement freeze and so forth. President Obama, I think, thought that Prime Minister Netanyahu was locked in the past, locked in this sort of, dinosaur way of thinking about things, that he was incapable of breaking out of his own right-wing coalition to find a real path to peace. So they were at odds. So nobody was happier to see President Trump elected anywhere in the world probably than Bibi Netanyahu. But I think they're disappointed right now. We just got back from Jerusalem, and I was there with Mike Scheer during President Trump's visit as well. I think there was some, he hasn't turned out to be what we want him to be. We thought we were getting free license, and he hasn't gotten a full free license. So it'll be interesting to see how he goes.
Young lady here in the blue.
Yeah, I'd love to hear about kind of the evolution of press access, over your coverage, especially now under this new administration.
Yeah. Well, it's not good. Look, you've seen what we've been seeing, right? I'm so happy today. This is at least one on-camera briefing that we can have in Washington here. We're it's
day in the office for Sarah Huckabee Sanders.
no, a tough day. You wouldn't want to be a press secretary, have to get up and figure those things out. It's grown very toxic. You know, it's always adversarial. It's meant to be adversarial. It's supposed to be adversarial. We are not the friends of the White House, and they're not our friends. We're supposed to have different roles, but that doesn't mean it can't be professional. And what is disappointing is when it gets taken to extremes, as it seems to be right now. Right. No president before President Trump loved the press, but they didn't say some of the things that this president says out loud. They would never, you know, what this president's trying to do is to make us the enemy because it's a good political thing as well as the fact that he just hates us. And you know, he calls us the opposition. He calls us enemy of the people.
Is it tactical though? Is it strictly tactical because this is a man who loves a camera? He loves to be quoted.
I think it's both. I think he genuinely thinks that. And I also think that it's convenient for him because he needs an enemy. And we are a very convenient enemy. And media bashing never lost anybody any votes. And let's face it, Democrats aren't a strong enough opposition in his mind now, so it's easier to go after the media. And we give him ammunition by doing stupid things from time to time and by playing into his way of thinking. And we need to, as a media corps, we need to make sure we try to resist that. It's not that we're not the opposition. Oh, of course. Because we are not the opposition, and we can't let him make us the opposition. That's not our role. We have an independent role in society. We need to fulfill that. This is a clarifying moment for journalism. But we are not a political actor. We are observers, and if they cut off access, then we will find other ways to write our stories.
Or as I like to say, we're the Constitution. Gentleman over here.
Back to Michelle. I saw her she gave a speech at the American Institute of Architects convention in Orlando. It was a home run speech. Every other word she said, she had a standing ovation. She was relaxed, smart. She looked great. So the question is she
Run for office?
interested in politics?
No, she's been asked. You're right. She's actually a really, really good speaker, right? I mean, for anybody who spent time watching, anybody who saw her at the convention, she's very good at that. Is she going to run for office? No. I mean, I shouldn't make predictions, but I would bet a lot of money that she'll never do that. She doesn't like it.
I want to circle back to the pictures because we've given him a bit short shrift. Where were we? I think we were at the last picture. Oh yeah,
I love that
Let's
picture, right?
talk about that relationship.
That's 2015 after Ukraine, and these guys did not like each other either. Remember what Obama said about Putin? He's like the kid slouching in his chair in the back of the class, right? And you know, Putin. He decided that Obama was weak and that he could roll him, and that's not. I think that he was surprised to some extent when Obama and the Europeans stood pretty strong against the Ukraine intervention. Now, you could say they should have done more, and that's a fair argument to be had. But I think Putin thought he could divide the United States and Europe, and he failed to at that. I think he also thought he could go further into Ukraine and get more support from the Russian-speaking population, and he failed in that regard. But Putin does not look like he's giving up. I mean, look what happened just this week on the cyber attack on Ukraine. We don't know who's responsible for that, but it seems reasonable to wonder whether it's Russia. And he's going to now meet with President Trump next month on the sidelines at the G20, and that's going to be the most watched meeting I think in years.
That we're not going to see because it's on the sidelines.
Yeah, but somehow people will talk about it, don't you think?
Of course they will.
Yeah.
Next, what's next?
This is Syria. This is Homs. This is I to say love is the wrong word. I find this picture very gripping because it's an Assad campaign poster there on this destroyed building. Right there's a man who destroyed Syria, smiling out there in that campaign picture. And look, no history of President Obama's administration is going to be complete without Syria. We've talked about it already, but it's a pretty gripping picture. This is on the border. These are Border Patrol agents stopping people coming across the border. Immigration, You know, it's this issue that President Obama struggled with. He tried, obviously, to get Congress to buy into some sort of a reform effort. He couldn't do it. He used his pen to do it, and that again shows the weakness or the disadvantage of executive actions, because then the next guy can come in.
But beyond President Obama, immigration is starting to creep up like Middle East peace. The issue that presidents can't seem to get their hands around and get through Congress or get through negotiations.
Yeah.
Bush couldn't get it done. Obama couldn't get it done. Is that sort of the
Trump
fate?
doesn't want to get it done.
Trump hasn't even touched it. And is that the fate of this particular issue, and not having covered presidents over time?
Yeah, for the moment anyway. Yeah, it's like look, healthcare was an issue that president after president after president tried to address and failed until somebody finally passed a program. This is the same. This may be the same kind of thing, and it's going to take a while till somebody figures out, you know, a reform effort. Remember, the last president to reform immigration in a comprehensive way was Ronald Reagan. So that was 30-some years ago.
Indeed. Yes. Back. Well, we touched this subject.
Yeah, that's the inaugural.
Selma.
This is Selma. I love this picture. It's a great picture. It's the 50th anniversary of the Selma March. I had the opportunity to go down and cover this, which was very moving. Tens of thousands of people there, and unfortunately, what this photograph cuts out, because it's President George Bush was there too, one of the few Republicans who came, because actually he thought that was important. He didn't speak, but he stood off. He was too far off to the side, so he's not shown in the picture.
And he wasn't the only one. Eric Cantor was down there. There's a bunch of people.
A couple other Republicans.
A bunch of people, because this was John Lewis's show.
Right.
What did that speak about this president or this presidency in terms of his? This is more. Did we pretty much cover this ground in terms of his approach to race and reconciliation?
I think we did cover it, but I do like the picture of John Lewis standing next to Barack Obama, right? These different generations, you know, what John Lewis went through to become who he is today, then, you know, leads to Barack Obama and who he became. And
what about I'll put a different political question on it, because when Barack Obama was running for president the first time, John Lewis was far from in his camp. He was in Hillary Clinton's camp and didn't come to his camp until the 11th hour and 59th minute, so to speak, in politics. And does that show us sort of a full circle moment?
It does. I mean, look, a lot of people didn't believe that Barack Obama was going to get anywhere, and they were going with, you know, the African American leaders, just like other Democrats felt that you know, the Clintons had been good to them and they were going to be loyal to them until.
And then South Carolina happened.
And then South Carolina happened, and suddenly, well, and even Iowa. Look, he won Iowa, a very white state, and he proved that he was something beyond a comet at that point. He was a serious figure to be reckoned with. Okay. That's of course, the night the Obergefell decision by the Supreme Court was found a constitutional right for same-sex marriage. The White House put up the rainbow colors. It's a very evocative picture. It's an interesting issue, right? Because this will be one of the things that President Obama claims as his legacy. But the truth is, he didn't actually have anything to do with it. That's not true. That's not entirely true. He did order the Justice Department not to defend the Defense of Marriage Act, and he obviously on other gay rights issues was a leader. But
he got lucky in the Supreme Court.
On marriage, he waited. He waited until basically it was already at the Supreme Court. It was already heading that direction until more than 2/3 of Democrats supported same-sex marriage. So in a way, on same-sex marriage, he was more of a follower than a leader. But he celebrated it, and then it became a running theme for him, especially in 2012. And what was fascinating was to see how in 2012 it was the Democrats running for president who were talking about same-sex marriage compared to 2004 when it was the Republicans, right, who were talking about opposition to same-sex marriage. So how much had changed in that 8 years, again, not because of necessarily anything Obama did, but where were the politics? The politics had shifted 180 degrees.
But you just hit on a generic issue of how presidents may be able to claim things that they're not necessarily responsible for. He's not the first, and he won't be the last.
Absolutely.
So what, besides LGBTQ issues, did President Obama pretty much ride the wave on, in your view?
Oh, that's a good question. I've often thought that economic upturns and downturns are less about what presidents do than forces that are often beyond their control. But obviously in that case he had such a different economy, and he actually did take real action. So I don't know that that's the case in this situation. It's a good question. I mean, like President Clinton, for instance, would talk about innovation, would talk about the information age, the advent of the internet. He loves being, associated in his view with the coming information age, the bridge of the 21st century. But how much that would have happened without him anyway, I don't know. These are good questions.
Okay, the next one. Next. The Vice interview.
This is right. This is in Oklahoma, the federal prison at Reno, Oklahoma. I was there with him for that as well. And he was talking about criminal justice reform. This is, again, one of these lost moments for him, because there was this moment where Republicans and President Obama and Democrats agreed that the sentencing laws needed fixing, that they were too harsh, that they were too inflexible, and that a whole generation of people were being put in jail because of minor drug crimes that was not healthy for society and not affordable for government. And the moment kind of came and went. He did what he could individually as president through his clemency power and through, Eric Holder changed some sentencing guidelines, but you already see President Trump changing the sentencing guidelines back, and the effort in Congress, which was bipartisan, seems to have
Stalled.
Yeah. But he said, the other thing he said in that day, which I thought was fascinating, was in effect, "There, but for the grace of God, go I."
That he could have been.
Because he smoked pot and did cocaine as a young man, as a young African-American man, and he met these people in this prison and thought to himself, and he said this out loud, he said, look, had things gone differently, I could have been one of these people who ended up spending years and years and years in prison for a stupid, youthful mistake. Now, not everybody in that prison obviously was there for something innocent, something relatively small, but there were enough. And I think he saw this sort of like the divide between being a prisoner and a president at that very moment seemed very small, right? How how different paths could have taken him.
But that goes back to courage. That's a second term thing, and these are the risks that he did not take his first term.
Yeah, he would tell you he was kind of busy his first term. That's a fair point, right? He had an economy on the verge of collapse. He had Iraq. He had Afghanistan. But you're right. He didn't want to say these things in the first term.
This picture.
Oh, I just like the picture. It's him going back into the Oval Office. It's just a evocative, colorful picture. But he's actually returning from a visit to Walter Reed here, and he did that a lot. He didn't advertise it. There weren't a lot of press coverage of it. Same with Bush, where they went to Walter Reed and they met and talked to wounded soldiers. And I think we ought to remember that about both those presidents, because it affected both of them. They were both very human in that way. They did not try to do it for publicity. They did it because they were president and the commander-in-chief, and they knew that was their responsibility.
It's time to sort of wind us down. Let's do that.
That's the last one.
This is the last one, and then we're gonna do some public service announcements and close it out.
But look at the body language, right? So President Obama is reaching out to him, right? This is the first time they met, by the way. Trump spent years saying this guy wasn't born in the United States, he wasn't a legitimate president. Obama mocked him from the stage, the 2011 White House Correspondents Association, but they'd never met in person. So this is the first time they meet. President Obama in this moment thinks he can influence President-elect Trump. He thinks he can help educate him, that he's a listener, that if he doesn't know much, so if I tell him this stuff, maybe he'll,
How did that work out for him?
Yeah, not so good. Yeah, obviously it was a mistake on his part. He really thought he could. And he has been quiet since January 20th, partly because he thought, at least at first, I think he thought that he might still have some influence there. I think he's probably given up on that idea now.
Before the last question, I want to thank some folks who put this together tonight. Lisa Matthews and Betsy Fisher-Martin and the team, Tamara Hinton, Lori Russo, Jamie Horowitz, and I'm seeing other ones, Joe Motheral. I'm seeing all the folks, our staff, Lindsay Underwood has been outside with the membership department, our executive director, Bill McCarran, and Heather Forsman Weaver. Collectively, you talk about teams, this is a team that makes me look really good and makes this club look really good. Without them, I look like crap. So I want to thank them, first of all. And second of all, I want to talk about some things coming up at the National Press Club. The Army Chief of Staff, General Mark Milley is coming here on July 27th as a headliner. We have the 44th Annual National Press Club Journalism Awards Dinner on July 28th, and several other things that I won't, with the shortage of time, won't get into. You can look on www.press.org, and it's all on the website, and you can support the club's efforts on this one. But before I give you the traditional National Press Club mug, last question. If you had a chance to sit down with former President Obama, what's the one question, if he only gave you one question to ask, that you haven't had a chance to ask, what would it be?
I would like to ask him about the Russia thing at the end. I think that's the one thing we really have not heard his voice on. What was he thinking? What did he know? What did he decide? Why did he decide it? What was his, does he have any regrets today? And what does he think about what's happening today? So I've had a lot of other questions, but that's one nobody I think has got a chance to ask him really in a fulsome way. So that would be an important one to ask.
So here you go.
Thank you.
Here's your mug. And books will be for sale outside, and I guess we can organize a little bit of a signing with Peter. Betsy's standing up with her Sharpie. And there are a lot of folks in the room I know that want to get their books signed, and I see a lot of my folks from the White House beat and other prior lives. I see Steve Scully in the back and other folks. Good. Thanks for coming, and we'll see you the next time.
Thank you very much.
Closer together with the mug.
Yeah.